I've been a passionate hiker for as long as I can remember, largely due to where I grew up. Living near parts of the Appalachian Trail, it becomes part of your lifestyle. Most people between Georgia and Maine have probably hiked some section of it in their lifetime. One spring, I set out for a solo hike, timing it after the rains had passed so the trail had some time to dry out. That weekend, there weren't too many hikers, but enough people were around, including day hikers and some campers like myself. It was a diverse group, so there was always someone around in case you needed help. This was day 2 of my 4-day trip, and I had planned to cover about 25 miles of backcountry hiking. My friend would pick me up at the designated trailhead. I had all the essentials in my backpack for the journey. On the second day, while coming around a bend, I saw 2 guys hanging around a tree stand. I waved, they waved back, and we both continued. They appeared to be resting, but then I noticed they were heading in the opposite direction, toward me. It's common to cross paths with people like that, so I didn't think much of it. It wasn't the first group I passed that morning. As we approached each other, I greeted them and asked where they were headed. They mentioned a lookout point, but I knew the direction they were going wasn't right for that. I told them as much, and they laughed, admitting they were lost. I offered to help since I knew the area well, and they accepted, but as we talked, it became clear they didn't actually know where they were going. They couldn't even tell me where they'd started. The longer we talked, the stranger it felt. They were avoiding my questions, talking in circles, and seemed uninterested in my help. Then, I noticed something odd. They were both too clean for people who claimed to have been out on the trail for a while. When I asked how long they'd been hiking, one said 2 days while the other said a week. That confirmed my suspicion. Something was off. Encounters with drunks or vagrants aren't uncommon on the trail, so I decided to move on and wish them luck. I told them if they kept going, they'd reach a parking lot in about 12 miles. They thanked me and went on their way. I hiked for the rest of the day without issue, though my feet began to hurt as the sun started setting. I decided it was time to set up camp for the night. Normally, I keep things simple and don't even bother with a fire, making it easier to pack up quickly in the morning. But this time, I decided to take my time, enjoy a meal, and settle in properly. I found a fire pit off the trail and got everything set up for dinner and the night ahead. My campsite was a few hundred feet away from the trail, which is what most people do to avoid camping directly on the trail. It also offers some privacy, especially for those awkward bathroom breaks. While I was preparing dinner, I noticed a steep cliff not far behind me. It was rugged and offered a great view of the trail in both directions. On a whim, I decided to climb it after finishing my meal to catch the fading sunset. This was out of character for me, but it turned out to be a life-saving decision. When I reached the top and settled in with my back against the rock, enjoying the view, I noticed something moving through the trees below. It was those 2 guys again, the ones I'd seen earlier. They were walking toward my camp but weren't on the trail. They were about 20 feet off, moving through the brush, trying to stay hidden. It was strange to see them again, especially since they were headed in the opposite direction earlier. Their movements were deliberate, like they were trying to be sneaky. I watched them closely, finishing my meal, and wondered what I should do next. As I mentioned before, you meet all kinds on the trail. Some people are harmless, while others are not. I decided it was best to return to my camp and make myself as invisible as possible. Back at my camp, I carefully put out my fire and packed up my gear. I had no way to lock anything, so I secured my backpack to a tree using zip ties, something I always carry with me. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it would slow anyone down if they tried to steal it. By now, the sun had fully set, and twilight was giving way to complete darkness. I was exhausted from the hike and settled into my bedding, holding my flashlight and knife close, just in case. I fell asleep listening to the wind and the sounds of insects. I'm not sure how long I slept, but I woke to the sound of footsteps in my camp. They were quiet but close, too close. I stayed still, listening as the footsteps circled around my fire pit and then moved toward my backpack, which was tied to the tree. I heard them fumble with the pack, trying to pick it up, but the zip ties held it in place. That's when I decided enough was enough. I sat up and yelled for them to leave. To my surprise, instead of running, one of the men lunged at me. He caught me off guard, but I had been preparing for this. We wrestled, but he had the upper hand since he'd literally jumped on me. I struggled to get free, only to have the other guy shove me back to the ground. Panic set in. I tried to talk my way out of it, but they weren't interested in listening. They just kept attacking. That's when it hit me. They weren't going to stop. Realizing the gravity of the situation, I fought back. I pulled out my knife and stabbed the man closest to me in the thigh. He screamed and backed off, and I yanked the knife free. His friend came at me, but I stabbed him in the foot. Both of them took off into the woods, screaming in pain. Shaken, I quickly packed up my gear and ran in the opposite direction, finding a place to hide until morning. At first light, I hurried back toward the trail, hoping to find someone. Eventually, I met a few hikers, but none of them had a phone. It wasn't until the third or fourth person that I got access to a satellite phone. We called for help, and I arranged to meet the rescue team at a nearby lot. I had a split lip and suspected I might have a concussion, but I was just glad to be alive. When I finally got to the hospital, I couldn't believe it. I saw those two guys there as well. I immediately told the police, who detained them. It turned out they'd been robbing hikers on the trail for months, and when the police searched their car, they found it filled with stolen gear. I was medically cleared within a day, but those men were arrested and charged. I have no idea what happened to them after that, but I hope they're still locked up. As for me, the attack left me with a touch of PTSD. I stayed indoors for nearly 2 years, just going to work and hanging out with friends, avoiding the outdoors entirely. Thankfully, I've since returned to my old ways. Many years back, our parents would take us on weekend trips, usually camping in the late summer or early fall. These trips were often in the same area. We'd drive out of town, following a road for around 40 miles until it intersected with a dirt path leading up a small mountain. This area was perfect for outdoor activities like dirt biking, hiking, or even target practice. The road wound up through the woods, splitting off into different paths leading to remote spots. If you followed the main road far enough, you'd reach an old, abandoned quarry. It wasn't huge, just a few large blast holes and heaps of broken rock. My brother and I loved playing around there during our trips. Oddly enough, most people never ventured beyond the quarry, maybe thinking it was still operational or assuming there was nothing beyond it. Past the quarry, the camping area was open and often deserted. We would always pick the flattest spot and have the whole place to ourselves. This trip was no different from the others. We set up camp under the clear sky and were excited to explore. We had a basic setup, a tent, a folding table, and 4 chairs. The fire pit was one we had used for years, surrounded by rocks that were perfect for warming up coffee or hot chocolate. We spent the day drinking soda and shooting at cans we'd set up on the hill. We had a couple of BB guns and a small rifle, nothing too dangerous or loud. Dad liked teaching us how to shoot, and my brother and I enjoyed it. Besides that, we spent time gathering firewood or carving small pieces of wood into different shapes, like animals or little ornaments. Sometimes, we'd just relax at camp, reading or listening to the sounds of nature around us. But our favorite activity was heading to the lake, which was just around a bend from the campsite. The road split into 2 there, with one path leading to an old iron gate. This gate blocked the original access road to the lake. That road had been closed off for years, possibly due to erosion or limited parking space. However, a secondary entrance was created decades ago, with a larger parking lot and easier access. Because the old road was no longer in use, it was like our own secret spot. My brother and I would often go to the lake by ourselves, free to explore without any supervision. That first morning, we woke up early with plans to spend the entire morning fishing. We got dressed, grabbed our gear, and started walking down the familiar dirt road that led to the lake. The walk was about 20 to 30 minutes, depending on how fast we went. Everything felt normal as we made our way down, but as we neared the gate, I noticed something strange. A car was parked right in front of it. It wasn't unusual to see cars parked there, but something about this one felt off. The car was nondescript, not new but not old, not dirty but not clean. Nothing stood out about it. As we got closer, I realized there were people sitting in the front seat. The man in the driver's seat leaned out of the window and called out, "Good morning, kids," in a cheerful voice. It seemed friendly enough, so we waved back and said good morning. "Where are your parents?" he asked. I told him they were back at the camp and would join us later. The woman in the passenger seat then spoke up, telling us to be careful as it was a long walk to the lake. We thanked them and continued on our way. Nothing about the encounter seemed too strange at first, though it did make me feel a little uneasy. As we walked on, the man called out again, "Is that your brother?" I nodded, feeling a bit uncomfortable now. "You better watch out for each other," he added with a strange grin. The smile on both their faces stretched unnaturally wide, and something about it felt wrong, like they were hiding something sinister. We hurried down the path to the lake, trying to shake off the creepy feeling. Once we reached the water, we set up our fishing rods and started casting our lines. The morning was perfect, clear skies, calm water, and no wind to disturb our casts. After a while, we decided to move to a spot that offered more shade. We walked along the shore to a rocky outcrop with some pine trees hanging over it. It gave us a bit of cover from the sun, and we resumed fishing. At one point, we caught a large trout and cheered as we brought it in. But then, my brother pointed out something odd. A dark stain on the rocks near the water. It looked like dried blood. Seeing blood by the water wasn't entirely unusual, as people cleaned fish there all the time. Still, it unsettled me. We kept fishing, but the sense of unease grew. Not long after, we noticed something even stranger. 2 shoes floating near the shore. They were dress shoes, fancy looking, and one of them had blood inside. I immediately thought of the couple we had seen earlier. The shoes had to belong to them, but how did they end up here? And whose blood was it? My brother and I decided it was time to head back to camp. We quickly packed up our gear and started the climb back up the dirt road. As we reached the top, I glanced back and saw something that made my heart race. A tarp, partly hidden in the bushes, stained with blood. That was the final straw. I grabbed my brother's hand, and we bolted up the path, not stopping until we reached the campsite. We told our parents everything, about the couple, the blood, the shoes, but they seemed to think it was just a misunderstanding or an overreaction. My dad even walked back down the trail to check things out, but found nothing unusual. Later that afternoon, we went back to the lake with our parents, but the strange couple was gone, and so were the shoes and the tarp. We never saw them again. It remains one of the creepiest memories from my childhood, and to this day, I wonder who those people were and what they were doing out there in the middle of nowhere. When my wife and I first tied the knot, she would take me to these huge family gatherings. They were always held far off the beaten path, usually at a ranch or cabin rental, and the extras would bring trailers or set up tents. It was the kind of reunion where even great-grandma in her wheelchair made it. As the new husband in the mix, I knew I had to show up and participate. I was blown away the first few times I attended, especially seeing the sheer number of people. The first day would probably see 100 folks, and by the second day, that number would easily double. People often asked if her family was Mormon or maybe from another large family culture, but they weren't, just good old Southern roots. One year, the gathering took place near a secluded lake. There was a string of cabins already booked for family, but since they were packed full, my wife and I set up our camping gear by the shore. This suited me just fine, as I grew up camping and could fish whenever I liked. It also created a bit of space between me and the 200 in-laws roaming around. We brought along our chocolate lab, Seymour, and our son Jack, who was about 5 years old at the time. After getting settled, we made the usual rounds, greeting Aunt Betsy, shaking hands with Grandpa Dill, and teasing all the nieces, nephews, and cousins. I might make it sound like a chore, but honestly, these events were fun, at least at first. Playing with the kids and catching up with family made for a good time. But after a few days, things often started to unravel. The kids would get bored and cranky, which in turn would irritate the adults. Before long, someone would be drinking too much and arguments would break out. But none of that had happened yet. It was just day one, and we were enjoying ourselves. There were endless trails in every direction, so I led a few hikes with my son and some of the cousins. It was a lot of fun. As I got a feel for the area, we ventured into more interesting terrain, eventually finding a dry wash full of geodes and an animal burrow under a tree, scattered with bones, probably from a cow or small game. Nothing alarming, but it was still a cool discovery for the kids. We looped back toward camp, passing through some trees when I spotted a hunter's blind. I froze for a second. I wasn't much of a hunter myself, but I could tell no one was in it. I had the kids crouch behind a fallen tree for cover while I quietly checked out the blind. The zipper flap in the back was open, and the inside was tidy with a stool by the window flap. No people, no shell casings, nothing. The fabric was sun-bleached and worn, suggesting it had been there for years. I signaled the kids, and we continued back to camp without thinking much more about it. After all, we were out in the wilderness. If there was going to be a hunting blind anywhere, this would be the place. Later that evening, families were settling in with their respective groups, and we were hanging out with Uncle Pete and his kids when we heard a long coyote howl. The kids scattered, but the adults laughed it off. The howling was a couple of miles away at least, and with over 100 people out there, half of whom were probably armed, there was no real threat. Still, the kids found it thrilling, howling back in response as we sat around the fire, roasting hot dogs and enjoying a salad. After dinner, we cleaned up, put Jack to bed, and sat by the fire, our dog Seymour snoozing nearby. This was always one of my favorite moments. Sitting by the fire, holding hands with my wife, and gazing up at the stars. The next day, more family arrived, about 70 more people, and the place got even busier. The kids had a treasure hunt. There was a 3-legged race, some potato cannons, a butter churning contest, and even a whittling class. These reunions had a way of bringing everyone together, teaching the kids life lessons through fun activities. But by the afternoon, the heat and boredom were starting to wear on people. The kids were whining about the lack of TV, and tensions were rising between different family groups. Little arguments broke out here and there, nothing serious, just the usual irritability that comes from too many people in one place. Jack and I went fishing, played fetch with Seymour, and took a sunset hike. My wife spent most of the time catching up with her family. By dinner, we were back at our campfire, with the lake behind us and the darkness creeping in. I remember the noise around the reunion growing louder as the night went on. Singing, clapping, kids getting rowdy. Eventually, things started to quiet down again. As we sat talking about fishing, someone pointed out a figure near the lake. I turned and saw a person standing by a tree, barely visible in the fading light. They were just standing there, swaying slightly. We laughed, assuming it was a tipsy cousin or uncle taking a break from the crowd. But after 10 or 15 minutes, someone mentioned that the figure was still there, just standing and possibly staring at us. I pulled Jack close to me, And that's when Seymour started growling, his fur standing on end. He was leashed, but he was pacing back and forth, teeth bared. Aunt Toddy guessed it was probably Luke, a cousin known for getting blackout drunk, and someone suggested I go check on him. So, I handed Jack to my wife and started walking toward the figure. But that uneasy feeling grew as I got closer. What if this wasn't Luke? What if it was someone else, or worse? I remembered the hunter's blind we'd found earlier and slowed my pace. The figure was only 20 or 30 feet away now, but I still couldn't make out any details. I reached into my pocket for a flashlight and clicked it on. To my shock, it wasn't a person standing by the tree. It was a black bear, casually sniffing the air. Black bears aren't the biggest of the species, but this one stood over 6 feet tall on its hind legs and must have weighed a few hundred pounds. I muttered something, probably an expletive, and started backing up. The bear seemed curious and began following me. I stopped, unsure what to do, and noticed a cub behind the bear. Things had just gone from bad to worse. I called out to the others, "Bear!" and hurried back to camp. The bear had followed me a few feet, but when I shined the light on it, it stopped. Within seconds, the whole camp was on high alert. People grabbed rifles and the teenagers waved sticks in the air, yelling to scare the bear off. Eventually, the bear backed into the woods, and we didn't see it again that night, though there were more sightings the next day. Looking back, I realized how close I came to danger that night. Had I approached it without the flashlight, that bear could have easily attacked me. Later, we found out that the family had rented a cabin in an off-season bear hunting area. We were right in the middle of bear territory, and none of us had any idea.